Welcome back to Last Dictarine, the place where we reveal the most shadowy tales lurking behind the facades of everyday existence. Today, we plunge into a case that will force you to rethink everything you believe about the meaning of family. This is the macabre chronicle of the Follings, a couple who, across 15 years, adopted 12 children, none of whom possessed birth certificates. What started out looking like a touching tale of compassion soon twisted into something truly malevolent. Before we get started, please take a second to subscribe to Last Dictarine and switch on notifications so you won't miss a single one of our weekly journeys into the bleakest reaches of human behavior. All right, let's begin. Tucked among the gentle hills of western Pennsylvania, the little town of Millbrook, with barely 3,000 residents, was the last place anyone would imagine a nightmare, so chilling it would eventually draw federal agents. This was a community where everybody recognized everybody else, where potluck suppers and Friday night football games formed the heart of social life, and where a neighbor still dropped off a casserole whenever illness struck. It was into this peaceful scene that Howard and Margaret Follings settled during the spring of 1978. Their home stood on Elm Street, a grand, rambling Victorian mansion pulled back from the road, half concealed behind a stand of towering old oaks. The place had sat empty for almost 10 years, long enough that townsfolk had nicknamed it the haunted house on the hill. But Howard Folling, a prosperous investment banker from Pittsburgh, recognized possibility in the crumbling building. Together with his wife Margaret, a former pediatric nurse, they poured serious money into restoring it, turning the decaying eyesore into the jewel of the neighborhood. They really seemed like such a charming pair. Remembers Elaine Winters, who lived directly across the street from the Follings for close to 2 decades. Howard was always perfectly turned out, even when he was simply picking up the mail. And Margaret, she carried herself with such grace, such refinement. You'd want them at your dinner table. Being around them somehow made you feel special. Yet, beneath that polished surface, the Follings concealed secrets that would one day stun the entire town. Public records show that Howard and Margaret could not have biological children. For Margaret, who had longed for a big family, this was a deep source of grief. She used to sit on the porch, just watching the kids in the neighborhood play. Elaine Winters recalls, there was this quiet sadness in the way she'd stay there for hours, observing their laughter and games. I used to think how perfect she would have been as a mother. And then, in the summer of 1980, it appeared her dream was coming true. The Follings announced they had adopted a baby boy named James. The town rejoiced. Neighbors threw a surprise baby shower. The church arranged a special blessing for the new parents and child. James Folling was a lovely little boy, bright-eyed, quick with a smile, and the Follings showered him with intense devotion. Margaret refused to let anyone else hold him, remembers Clara Jenkins, who went to the same church. Not even during the blessing. When the pastor reached for him, she got this wild, trapped animal look. Howard had to murmur something to her before she'd release the baby. And even then, she hovered so close the pastor could feel her breath. Looking back, that fierce possessiveness stands out as an early warning sign, but back then, people chalked it up to the fierce protectiveness of a first-time mother who had waited years for a child. Less than 2 years later, the Follings welcomed a second child, a girl they called Elizabeth, followed swiftly by Thomas, Catherine, and William. By 1985, they had 5 adopted children, everyone under 6 years old. The pace of those adoptions raised eyebrows, especially considering how slow Pennsylvania's adoption system usually moved. Yet Howard's wealth and connections combined with the couple's spotless reputation, smoothed every path. People saw them as heroes, says Detective Richard Cooper, who later headed the investigation. A rich couple rescuing kids who might otherwise end up lost in foster care. Who was going to challenge that? Who would even want to? Still, certain peculiarities should have sounded alarms. None of the Falling children ever enrolled in public school. Margaret chose to homeschool them all. The kids were seldom spotted around town, and when they were, they stayed glued to their parents. No sports, no clubs, no friends beyond the family circle. I once tried to set up a play date between my son and James, says former resident Patricia Hayes. They were the same age, and James looked so isolated. But Margaret always had a reason. Sickness, too much homework, an upcoming family trip. Eventually I gave up asking. That profound isolation might have gone on forever, if not for a single incident in the summer of 1987. 9-year-old Thomas fell out of a backyard tree and fractured his arm. Despite her nursing background, Margaret did not bring him to a hospital. She tried to set the bone herself, creating a compound fracture that quickly became infected. Only when Thomas spiked a life-threatening fever did Howard override his wife and rush the boy to the ER. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency physician at Millbrook General that night, still remembers the case vividly. By arrival, he was already in septic shock. We performed emergency surgery just to save the arm, and even then he suffered major nerve damage. But what really unsettled me was how the child behaved. He never cried. Not once. And when I asked how the injury happened, he glanced at his father first, as though he needed approval to answer. Her unease grew when she requested medical records and learned none existed. Howard claimed all the children's files had been destroyed in a fire at a previous adoption agency. When Dr. Chen pressed for details, he grew visibly upset and threatened to move Thomas elsewhere. That was the moment I realized something was seriously wrong. Dr. Chen says, but I had only hunches, no hard evidence. And in a small town like Millbrook, suspicions about a family like the Follings could ruin your professional life. Even so, she submitted a report to Child Protective Services, flagging possible medical neglect. Caseworker David Morris was assigned. He visited the home, spoke with the parents, watched the children, and 3 weeks later filed a report finding no abuse or neglect. The house was tidy and secure, he wrote. Margaret had tried to treat the injury herself because of her medical training and a lifelong fear of hospitals, rooted in her own childhood. Ill-advised, yes, but not deliberate neglect. Case closed. Life in Millbrook resumed its quiet rhythm. The Follings pressed forward, adopting Robert, Anne, and Henry between 1988 and 1990. By then, murmurs had begun circulating about the odd family on Elm Street. How could they adopt so many children so fast? Why were the kids almost never seen in public? And why did every one of them wear the same hollow, vacant stare, as though something essential had been hollowed out? I'd watch them in church. Clara Jenkins recalls. 8 kids lined up perfectly, never squirming, never whispering. Nothing normal children do during a long sermon. They simply sat, eyes fixed forward. It felt wrong. Yet the community largely kept those questions private. The Follings donated generously to local causes. Howard served on several prominent charity boards. On the surface, they remained model citizens. Everything changed in the winter of 1992 when Michael and Susan Fletcher moved to town with their teenage daughter Emily. They settled just a few houses down from the Follings. Michael had taken a reporting job at the Millbrook Gazette. Susan was a social worker experienced in child welfare cases. Mom picked up on something strange about the Falling kids almost immediately. Emily Fletcher, now in her 40s, says today, Having worked with traumatized children before, Susan recognized classic trauma responses: flinching at sudden motion, avoiding eye contact, constantly glancing toward Margaret as though waiting for a signal. Susan began quietly documenting behaviors that troubled her. She also tried to befriend Margaret, hoping to gain insight into the household. At first, Margaret seemed open, perhaps viewing Susan as a possible ally amid growing local curiosity. The two women met for coffee. Occasionally, Susan was invited inside the Follings home. During one visit, she noticed something unsettling. Mom told me about a third-floor room that was always locked. Emily remembers. She could hear movement inside, shuffling feet, sometimes soft crying. When she asked Margaret, the answer was that it was only storage and the old house made odd noises. But Mom didn't buy it. Her suspicions deepened in spring 1993 when she glimpsed an unfamiliar child, a girl with long dark hair, peering from a third-floor window of the Follings house. The moment Susan looked up, the face vanished. When she mentioned it to Margaret, Margaret brushed it off, saying it must have been Elizabeth or Catherine. But by then Susan had met all the known Follings children and was certain this was someone else. Around the same period, Michael Fletcher was researching a series on adoption fraud for the Gazette. His reporting uncovered several Pennsylvania and neighboring state agencies shut down in the 1980s for placing children illegally without proper paperwork. Dad never directly linked it to the Follings in print. Emily says, "But I remember him telling Mom the timeline fit perfectly with when the Follings began adopting their first wave of kids. Coincidentally, or not." Shortly after those articles appeared, the Follings announced 2 more adoptions, twins Peter and Paul, then a girl named Mary. That brought their official count to 11. Once again, the process moved with uncanny speed. In retrospect, it's obvious they exploited every loophole. Detective Cooper explains. They used multiple agencies, often crossing state lines. They leveraged paperwork from earlier adoptions to prove they were seasoned parents, and they specifically requested children from troubled backgrounds. Kids less likely to have complete records, kids who could easily disappear through the cracks. But what drove them to adopt so many children? Those closest to the couple insist Margaret's longing for a large family felt authentic. She had fully embraced the role of devoted mother she had always craved. Howard, though less visibly enthusiastic, seemed content to support his wife's dream. It wasn't financial. Cooper stresses. The Follings were already rich. Adoption subsidies were tiny back then. And it wasn't about social prestige. If anything, such a big family drew more attention than they probably wanted. The real answer, when it finally surfaced, proved far darker than anyone had guessed. In fall 1994, Susan Fletcher received a breast cancer diagnosis. The disease advanced quickly. By spring 1995, she was homebound under hospice care. Facing the end, she chose to entrust her suspicions about the Follings to someone who could act. She called me to her bedside one evening. Cooper, then a young detective with the Millbrook PD, recalls. She handed me a thick file, pages of notes, inconsistencies in Margaret's stories, photos she'd snapped of the house, including that third-floor window where she'd seen the unknown child. She made me swear I'd follow up after she was gone. Susan Fletcher passed away on June 12, 1995. Cooper honored the promise, though he moved carefully at first. The Follings wielded real influence in Millbrook. Any accusation would face fierce pushback. He started with public records, property deeds, tax documents, the little that existed about the adoptions. Most adoption files were sealed, but he confirmed the couple had dealt with at least 5 agencies across 3 states. He also noticed a pattern. Each adoption was accompanied by a sizable donation to the agency. Not necessarily illegal, but certainly unusual. Another discovery. Howard had set up trust funds for every adopted child. On paper, it looked generous. Financial security when they turned 25. But the conditions were restrictive. Access required ongoing regular contact with the adoptive parents and a promise never to search for biological origins. Control, Cooper says flatly. Every single thing they did circled back to control. With that insight, he shifted to more direct methods. Regular drive, buys of the house, conversations with neighbors, brief contacts with teachers who had seen the children during mandatory testing, and tracking down former household staff. Those employees never stayed long. People worked there a few months, maybe a year, then vanished. Cooper notes. No notice, no forwarding address, just gone. One former housekeeper, Maria Vasquez, had left Millbrook in 1991 after only 6 months with the Follings. Cooper located her in a small Ohio town, living under her maiden name. At first, she refused to discuss her old employers, but when he showed her Susan Fletcher's file, her demeanor changed. She began to cry. Cooper remembers. "So someone else knows," she said. "Someone else has seen." Then the words poured out. She couldn't stop. Vasquez described a rigid, ever-shifting rule system designed to crush the children's spirits and guarantee obedience. Each child had a separate bedroom. Entering another's room was forbidden. They were required to address Howard and Margaret as Sir and Madame, never Mom or Dad. But the most chilling detail concerned the third floor. 3 rooms stayed permanently locked. Vasquez's job was to place trays of food outside the doors 3 times daily. She was never permitted to look inside. She could hear children's voices, crying, sometimes soft singing. When she questioned Margaret, the answer was that these were special needs. Children who needed isolation for safety. Vasquez finally quit after watching Margaret punish 11-year-old James for speaking at dinner without permission. The penalty: standing motionless in a corner all night, with Margaret checking hourly to make sure he hadn't shifted. She told me she packed and left before sunrise, Cooper says. She wasn't only afraid of losing the job. She feared what the Follings might do if they knew she disapproved. Vasquez's account, combined with Susan Fletcher's notes, gave Cooper enough to push for a formal inquiry. He presented his findings to Chief Raymond Wallace, expecting backing. Instead, he was ordered to stand down. The chief said there wasn't sufficient evidence to justify investigating such an upstanding family. Cooper recalls. He pointed out Howard's friendships with the mayor, the DA, half the town council. He suggested my connection to the Fletchers was clouding my judgment. A frustrated but resolute, Cooper continued working off the books, on his own time, keeping records at home. He focused especially on the mystery children supposedly hidden upstairs. Children not listed among the 11 official adoptions. The breakthrough arrived from an unexpected direction. 19-year-old Emily Fletcher, following in her father's journalistic footsteps, had never let go of her mother's worries. She had been quietly researching missing children reports from the regions where the Follings adopted. "I spotted a pattern," Emily explains. "In at least 3 cases, within a month of the Follings adopting a child from a particular area, another child from that same area vanished. Always vulnerable kids, foster children, children of migrant workers, kids from families struggling with addiction or poverty, children whose absence might not draw immediate attention." Emily shared her discoveries with Cooper, who used law enforcement databases to dig deeper. In every instance she flagged, the missing child had never been located, and the investigations had been minimal. It felt like those kids were disposable to the system, Cooper says, his voice still carrying bitterness. With this new evidence, Cooper bypassed Chief Wallace and sent his full dossier. Vasquez's testimony, Susan's notes, Emily's research, his own observations. To a former colleague, Lisa Harper, now with a state task force on crimes against children, Harper treated the material seriously. Within days, she obtained a search warrant for the Follings residence. Securing the warrant was only step one. Carrying it out would become one of the toughest operations Cooper ever faced. "We had to act fast and hard," he explains. "Any leak in the Follings could destroy evidence, or worse, harm the children. But we also knew their connections. If word reached them through regular channels, the whole thing could collapse." Harper assembled a team, state troopers plus agents from the Department of Justice's Child Exploitation Unit. Cooper joined as local liaison. The plan called for a dawn raid, hitting the household while everyone slept. On October 23, 1995, unmarked cars rolled up to the Follings estate just before first light. Officers secured the perimeter, then announced themselves. Howard answered the door in a silk bathrobe. According to Cooper, he displayed zero surprise. "He was expecting us," Cooper says. "Somehow he already knew. He invited us inside like we were arriving for cocktails. Perfectly composed. Perfectly in command." Margaret reacted very differently. When she understood what was happening, she became hysterical, shrieking that the police had no right to enter, that they were traumatizing her children. Officers had to physically restrain her after she lunged at a female trooper. The search proceeded systematically, teams covering separate sections. The 11 known adopted children were located in their bedrooms, already awake, fully dressed, sitting rigidly on the edges of their beds as though waiting for review. They showed no emotion at the sight of strangers, no fear, no curiosity, nothing. Like they had been hollowed out. Harper later wrote, "Attempts to interview the children met only rehearsed answers that revealed nothing. Even 17-year-old James, legally old enough to speak freely, would only repeat, 'Sir and Madam provide everything we need. We are happy here.'" The real nightmare waited on the third floor. As Vasquez had described, 3 rooms were locked. Officers forced the doors. Inside they found 3 children, a girl around 10 and 2 boys who looked about 8. Unlike the children downstairs, these 3 reacted with raw terror. Cowering, hiding their faces, whimpering at the strangers. The conditions were horrific. Cooper says, anger still tightening his voice years later. Bare rooms, nothing but mattresses on the floor. No toys, no books, nothing that belonged in a child's space. Windows blacked out with curtains nailed shut. And the smell overpowering. These children had been living in their own waste. Later medical exams confirmed severe malnutrition and clear signs of physical abuse. None spoke fluent English, suggesting origins in non-English speaking homes. None appeared in any official record. No birth certificates, no adoption documents. They were, in Cooper's words, ghosts, children erased from existence. That discovery escalated the case from suspected abuse to potential kidnapping, human trafficking, and federal document fraud. The FBI joined. Howard and Margaret were arrested immediately. As officers led them out, Margaret broke away, ran to the staircase, and screamed words in a language no one recognized. Later linguistic analysis suggested glossolalia, speaking in tongues, sometimes linked to certain religious practices, but also seen in extreme psychological distress. That was the first time I wondered whether religion played a role. Cooper reflects. Until then, I thought it was simply about Margaret's obsessive need to control a huge family she could mold. But that scream on the stairs hinted at something ritualistic, something much deeper. As the investigation unfolded, those suspicions would be horrifyingly confirmed. With the Follings in custody, Attention turned to grasping the full extent of their crimes and, most urgently, identifying and aiding the victims. The 3 hidden children entered emergency foster care. The 11 officially adopted children were placed in a specialized group home for traumatized youth. Interviewing proved difficult. The 11 adopted children stuck rigidly to their scripted lines. The 3 hidden children were too deeply traumatized to communicate clearly. They recoiled from sudden movement, avoided eye contact, and panicked when separated. They only trusted each other, says child psychologist Dr. Evelyn Morrow, who worked extensively with them. That made sense after what they'd endured. Their only consistent human contact had been each other and occasional visits from Margaret, who called her visits treatments. Through art therapy, the hidden children eventually described those treatments. Margaret made them drink a bitter liquid that caused drowsiness, then chanted what sounded like prayers or incantations. Sometimes she drew symbols on their skin with a dark substance, possibly ink, possibly blood. The ritual element was unmistakable, Dr. Morrow says, yet it didn't match any established religious tradition. It appeared to be a private mythology Margaret had constructed and forced onto these vulnerable children. While Dr. Morrow supported the children, Cooper and federal agents combed the house for evidence. In Howard's study, they located a concealed safe holding multiple sets of forged adoption documents and large amounts of cash in different currencies. The most disturbing item was a leather-bound journal in Margaret's handwriting, covering nearly 2 decades. It laid out her self-described mission to build the perfect family. In her words, every child was born carrying sin that had to be purged before true purity could emerge. The purging required severing ties to the birth family, erasing the original identity, and reshaping the child according to her design. She viewed herself as their savior. In her mind, she wasn't harming them. Cooper explains. She was rescuing them, cleansing their pasts and granting them a purified new life inside her family. The journal divided the children into 2 groups, the redeemable, so the 11 officially adopted children who could be purified through discipline and indoctrination, and the vessels. The vessels, 3 found upstairs, plus others who had come before, served a darker purpose. Margaret believed certain children were already too corrupted to save. Instead, they became containers for the sins purged from the redeemable ones, a twisted form of spiritual transference. She thought she could draw evil out of one child and deposit it into another. That explained the treatments the hidden children described. Rituals meant to shift perceived sin from her adopted children into these unfortunate vessels. Once a vessel became full, a state Margaret claimed she could detect by looking into their eyes, they were discarded. The journal never explicitly detailed what discarded meant, but it referred to a resting place on the property where the filled ones sleep until Judgment Day. That reference triggered the grimmest phase of the investigation. A thorough search of the estate grounds. In a wooded corner, far from the house, cadaver dogs signaled on a patch of undisturbed soil. Excavation uncovered the remains of 5 children in shallow graves, marked only by small stones. The medical examiner estimated the oldest burial dated to around 1981, shortly after James's adoption, and the most recent to less than a year before the raid. All 5 had died from the same combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and exposure, essentially neglected to death. Forensic efforts to identify the remains were hampered by missing dental records and DNA references. Eventually, 3 were tentatively matched to missing persons reports. Maria Gomez, 9, vanished from a central Pennsylvania migrant camp in 1981. Tyrell Washington, 7, missing from a Pittsburgh housing project in 1985, and Alexei Petro, 8, son of Russian immigrants, who disappeared from his Philadelphia front yard in 1990. The remaining 2, officially Jane Doe No. 1 and John Doe No. 3, stay unidentified. Those 2 still haunt me. Cooper says quietly. Someone loved them. Someone missed them. Yet they died nameless and were buried without ceremony, as though they had never existed. As evidence piled up, the legal case against the Follings looked airtight. Yet the courtroom battle proved almost as twisted as the crimes. Howard hired top-tier defense attorneys who immediately worked to separate him from Margaret's actions. They portrayed him as an unwitting husband, too preoccupied with business to notice what happened at home. They emphasized his frequent travel and Margaret's role as primary caregiver. It was a flimsy defense, says Assistant U.S. Attorney Meredith Lane, who led the prosecution. Howard signed every fraudulent adoption document. He created the trust funds with their controlling terms. He built the locked third-floor rooms. He may not have conducted the rituals, but he facilitated everything. A court-ordered psychological evaluation found Margaret incompetent to stand trial due to severe delusional disorder with religious fixations. She was committed to a secure psychiatric facility, where she remained until her death from breast cancer in 2008. Stripped of the ability to fully blame his wife, Howard changed course. His lawyers negotiated a plea agreement, cooperation, and testimony in exchange for a lighter sentence. Specifically, they offered information about additional vessels, whose remains lay outside the Elm Street property. It was agonizing, Lane admits. We wanted the maximum penalty for Howard's crimes, but the chance to bring closure to more families, to name more lost children, that was impossible to dismiss. A deal was reached. Howard pleaded guilty to multiple counts of child endangerment, kidnapping, and falsifying federal documents. He received 25 years to life, with parole eligibility after 20. His cooperation led investigators to 3 more burial sites on properties the Follings had briefly owned: a lake house in upstate New York, a hunting cabin in rural West Virginia, and a beach house on Maryland's shore. 8 additional sets of remains were recovered, raising the total victim count to 13. 13 vessels for 12 redeemable children, Cooper observes. In Margaret's warped logic, there always had to be more vessels because some filled faster than others. It was her perverse math of salvation. Of those 8 later victims, 5 were identified: Lucia Diaz, 9, Quame Johnson, 7, Tran Ngayan, 10, Sarah Blackfeather, 8, and Dmitry Kowalski, 6, all reported missing between 1983 and 1992 from marginalized communities where missing children cases frequently received little follow-up. The Follings were predators, Lane says. They deliberately chose children whose disappearances would barely register. No headlines, no sustained pressure on law enforcement. They exploited the exact same systemic gaps they used to adopt their redeemable children without scrutiny. The 12 officially adopted children met varied, often tragic fates. James, the eldest, took his own life in 1998, 3 years after the arrests. Elizabeth developed severe anorexia and has spent much of adulthood in and out of treatment. Thomas, the boy whose broken arm first drew attention, vanished after turning 18 and remains missing. Some of the younger children found new adoptive families, others stayed in foster care until aging out. The trauma ran too deep. Dr. Morrow explains. They were brainwashed from early childhood to equate their value with purity. And purity required suffering. That isn't healed in a handful of therapy sessions. The 3 hidden children, later identified as siblings Sofia Herrera, 10, and twins Mateo and Carlos Herrera, 8, were eventually reunited with their migrant worker parents near San Diego. Local police had initially dismissed the disappearance, assuming the family had simply moved on. It was miraculous they were still alive, Cooper says. According to Margaret's journal, Sophia was already considered nearly filled. A few more months, and she would have been discarded. Howard Falling died in prison in 2011 after serving 16 years. He never showed remorse, insisting to the end that he had merely supported his wife's dream of a large family. His multi-million-dollar estate was distributed among surviving victims through a civil settlement. The Elm Street mansion was demolished in 1997. The land became a community garden dedicated to the children who suffered and died there. Each year on the anniversary of the raid, Millbrook residents gather in the garden for a vigil, 13 lanterns for the vessels, 12 candles for the redeemable children whose lives were irrevocably changed. It's not enough. Cooper says, nothing could ever be enough to repair what those children endured. But it's a gesture. It says we remember, we acknowledge what happened here, and we regret we didn't see it sooner. The Falling case spurred major reforms. The 1998 Follings Act in Pennsylvania introduced stricter background checks for adoptive parents, caps on the number of adoptions per family in a given period, and mandatory home visits by social workers for the first 5 years post-adoption. The system failed those children. Lane states plainly, we all did. Neighbors who sensed something wrong but stayed silent. Doctors who saw red flags but didn't press harder. Officials too dazzled by Howard's wealth and position to probe deeply. Even law enforcement. We should have acted decisively on Susan Fletcher's concerns from the start. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that more victims may never be found. Howard's cooperation covered only sites directly tied to the Follings. Given their frequent travel and Howard's business interests across states, other vessels could still lie undiscovered. I've accepted we may never know the complete scope of their crimes, Cooper says, but I can't accept that parents out there still don't know what happened to their sons and daughters. That's why, even in retirement, I keep returning to the files. I chase every lead, however faint. Those children deserve names. They deserve their stories told. So the macabre history of the Follings continues to unfold long after the crimes came to light. It stands as a warning darkness can hide behind perfect respectability. Vulnerable children can vanish through society's cracks. And when those entrusted to protect them betray that trust, the consequences are devastating. Before we close today's episode, I want to pause and honor the identified victims: Maria Gomez, Tyrell Washington, Alexi Petro, Lucia Diaz, Quame Johnson, Tran Nguyen, Sarah Blackfeather, Dmitry Kowalski. Their lives were stolen by unthinkable cruelty. By sharing their names, we refuse to let them be forgotten. And to Jane Doe, 1 John Doe, 3 and the 3 remaining unidentified children, we may never know your names, but we bear witness to your pain. You mattered. You have always mattered. This has been Last Dictarin. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. If you have information about missing children, please contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST. Even decades later, the truth can still surface. Until next time, stay watchful. The worst deeds often unfold in the places we least suspect. In the decades following the case, scholars, psychologists, and true crime researchers have continued exploring the roots of Margaret's belief system. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a religious studies professor at the University of Pennsylvania, has analyzed the journal and court records extensively. Margaret's worldview doesn't fit neatly into any known tradition. Montgomery explains. It borrows familiar ideas: sin, purification through suffering, ritual cleansing, but recombines them in a completely personal, idiosyncratic way. Born Margaret Phelps in 1945 in rural Minnesota, she grew up in a secretive, deeply religious farming family. Neighbors described odd practices in the Phelps home, though nothing provable. At 18, she left for nursing school in Minneapolis, severing ties with her family. School records show she never returned home. No relatives attended her graduation. After graduating in 1965, she worked at hospitals across the Midwest, rarely staying longer than a year or two. In the early 1970s, she traveled to Europe for reasons that remain unclear. Among items seized from the Falling House were obscure 17th-century manuscripts on alchemy, Gnosticism, and mystical practices involving spiritual transference. The notion that sin or virtue could be moved between human vessels. These weren't popular religious texts. Montgomery stresses. They were rare, fragmented works. Margaret must have deliberately sought them out. By the time she met Howard at a 1975 Pittsburgh charity event, the core of her belief system was already formed, though she initially kept it hidden from him. Howard, focused on wealth and status rather than religion, may never have fully grasped it, or may have deliberately ignored the extent of her convictions. I don't buy his claim that he was completely in the dark, Cooper says. He lived in that house for 15 years. He saw what was happening. Others suggest he viewed Margaret's beliefs as harmless eccentricity, something to indulge because he loved her. Regardless, his money, connections, and silence enabled everything. Together they created a perfect storm, Margaret's vision paired with Howard's resources. Trapped between them were 25 children, 12 redeemable, 13 vessels, whose lives were shattered. Of the 12 adopted children, only 9 survived today. Besides James's suicide and Thomas's disappearance, Catherine died of a drug overdose in 2007 at 28. The surviving 9 mostly avoid publicity, having changed names and tried to rebuild far from their past. Elizabeth is the only one who has spoken publicly. In a 2015 documentary interview, she described the household's atmosphere of constant dread. "We lived in terror of disappointing them," she said. Sarah and Madam had rules that shifted without warning. What was allowed one day could earn punishment the next. We stayed on edge, always watching. She also recounted the cleansing rituals, bitter teas, kneeling inside drawn circles, long chants in unknown languages, small cuts to collect blood in a silver cup. Madam told us we carried sin from our birth families like a sickness. Elizabeth recalled, only she could cure it. If we resisted, the sin would grow and consume us, and then we'd join the bad children upstairs. The adopted children were occasionally shown the vessels through a small door window as a warning. They looked empty, Elizabeth said, thin, filthy eyes already dead. Madam would say, "This is what happens when you let the sin win." That combination of psychological terror, physical deprivation, and total isolation produced absolute control. The children depended on Margaret and Howard for food, shelter, contact, even their sense of reality. It was cult-like. Dr. Morrow explains. The leader defines truth, goodness, evil. Outside influences are eliminated. Over time, the followers absorb the leader's reality so completely they can no longer separate it from their own thoughts. That explains why many of the adopted children continued defending the Follings even after rescue. They had known no other world. They had no reference point to recognize abuse. Healing has been slow and uneven. Some, like James, never escaped the trauma. Others, like Elizabeth, cycle through progress and setbacks, carrying wounds from childhood that never fully close. The real tragedy isn't only the 13 who died, Dr. Morrow says. It's the 12 who lived but were robbed of any chance to become who they could have been. Their potential was erased as surely as the vessel's lives were. The Falling case remains a subject of study for law enforcement, social workers, psychologists, and religious scholars. A stark example of how wealth and status can shield abuse, how destructive ideologies can grow in isolation, and how easily vulnerable children can slip through protective systems. If there is any positive legacy, Cooper says, it is greater vigilance, reformed laws, closer scrutiny, willingness to question when something feels wrong. The community garden that replaced the Falling mansion now holds 25 trees, 12 oaks for the redeemable children, 13 willows for the vessels. Year by year they grow, branches stretching upward as quiet proof that even from poisoned ground, life can still rise. And so we conclude our examination of the macabre history of the Fallings. A story of horror, yes, but also of courage. Susan Fletcher's courage in raising the alarm, Maria Vasquez's courage in fleeing yet remembering, Detective Cooper's courage in persisting against resistance, and above all the courage of the survivors who carry their burdens and keep living. May we honor them by staying watchful. May we ensure such darkness never again hides behind respectability, wealth, and the fear of asking hard questions. And may we never forget the names of those who did not survive Maria, Tyrell, Alexi, Lucia, Quame, Tran, Sarah, Dimitri, and the 5 whose names remain unknown, but whose lives held the same worth. This has been Last Dicterin. Until next time, remember, the hardest stories to tell are often the ones that matter most. Thank you for listening.